Welcome back, everybody, to Boarderline Genius. We're at episode 10 now, which is fantastic. We've hit double figures in year one, so I'm pretty stoked about that. By way of introduction, my name's Andrew. I'm a games creator from Australia. I've created this little guy called Footy Feud, which is officially licensed by our Australian Football League, and also soon to release an official Marvel game into the Australian market as well, which I'm also super excited about. But really the objective of this interview series / podcast is to shine a light on game designers, so that really fellow game designers or anybody who has a passion about gaming can pick up hopefully some gold or two, some really key insights that have really governed our projects. What's set us up for success, equally what we've really learnt from it as well. So really excited to have a second international guest outside of Australia on the show today. I'm filming this in Melbourne, Australia, and we're speaking with Jeff, who is in Montana in the great USA. So Jeff, fantastic to have you on the show today.
Oh, so honored to be with you, Andrew. I can't tell you how excited I am and honored that I'm only the second guy that you've spoken with outside of Australia. I'm super stoked because it's like I've been kind of in solitary confinement in prison for several years working on a game design, and it's kind of nice that actually I've received a bit of a more lenient sentence now, and I'm able to return to the general population and share some of the insights of game design with other people. So.
Absolutely. Well, that's probably a really good place to start. Right? I know that we've connected offline with, when your visions for Vrahode started, but even before we dive into your current project, which is an absolutely mammoth undertaking that you've embarked on with your team, I'm really keen to understand a bit more about, even before this, how you got into game design, what your first project was, and how that experience was for you.
Well, I mean, I couldn't have come at this thing more from an obtuse angle that's completely unusual for game design. And hopefully it gives people hope. I actually came at game design through an extended illness.
Okay, sure.
And I was sick at home. And I had this love of a world called Vrahode in my head. And I decided to write a game design in the world of Vrahode, which it kind of came to me in 1990 when I was a fine arts student at college.
Sure.
And so I thought, hey, this world really deserves some kind of interactive medium. And I kind of originally set out to write novels about it. However, even though I'm a decent writer, I kind of labor over my writing.
Sure.
And so I started to recognize that I just wasn't prolific enough. I couldn't get the pages out. And I felt like maybe an interactive medium like gaming was a better approach. And so I created this kind of fantasy homage to Axis and Allies, which was a very famous Milton Bradley title, part of the Masters series. And so I came up with this kind of idea that in Vrahode there could be this basically this massive war ensuing where fantasy generals of armies would kind of augment the powers of the troops under their command. And so I set out to write this rule book, and I was a graphic design student. And so I set out to write this game, and I created the prototype for this game called the Vrahode Chronicles. And I ultimately sent the prototype off to Fantasy Flight Games, who at the time was kind of the big dog in the U.S. They were kind of the big game maker. And they said, this is the most beautiful prototype we've ever seen. This game is amazing, but this game is a $150 game. Yeah. And right now we're making $12 games. And so I chalked it up to this, this exceptionally good learning experience. And I learned that writing rule books was a bit more like constructing an electrical schematic than it was writing prose for a novel. And so it was a really, really informative educational experience in writing rule books. But I knew when I did it that it was not what was right for the world of Vrahode. And I knew in the back of my mind that what Vrahode needed or would best serve Vrahode was a cooperative game where you and I can play heroes together and kind of go through the story of as heroes to save the world, not as combatants in a war, but as comrades do this together. And so that's where we find ourselves now is this iteration.
Yeah. And I guess what then kind of prompted that shift to it being combative, and whenever you kind of think about a war or a battle where there's a one side versus the other, what was, I guess, that moment of inspiration and hence that thinking that led you to think that the game and the saga would be better based as a cooperative experience as opposed to that?
I think it happened before I ever started on that effort. It just happened. It happened from a desire to share the world. And it was almost kind of this flailing of, I've got to share this world with people. I don't care how it happens. I just have to do it. Yeah. And so I combined my love of Axis and Allies, which is a dice chucker, chances for a 4 or less, roll. 6 chances for a 3 or less, roll. 10 chances for a 2 or less, roll. I loved that kind of dice chucker experience. But ultimately, I knew it wasn't right for Vrahode. I just knew it. Yeah. Because I tend to fall in love with worlds. I tend to fall in love with this idea that I can get out of the world I'm in and go to another world and experience a different life. And so I kind of knew from the beginning it wasn't the right iteration for the game. But now I feel so comfortable in where we are and just so glad that I waited and that I rediscovered Vrahode from the right point of view. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm keen to go all the way back to probably when you first pitched it. So as you said, the big dogs at the time. I think that we're quite lucky now through conventions and through the amount of different gaming companies out there that I guess there is an opportunity to at least elevate a pitch. But how did you even find that experience way back then? You've come up with an idea, you've created, in their words, the most beautiful prototype they've seen, but then you're still completely fresh to the industry, right? So how did you even find that experience of pitching to them, receiving their feedback, actioning and digesting what they said?
Well, I would say this to Australian designers, be brave, be fearless. You have to go out there and risk your ego. Risk your ego. Yeah. Risk this idea that you have what's the next best thing, with the possibility that you don't, that you have something that is maybe even less than mediocre. That's fine. What I pitched to Fantasy Flight was not a good fit. It was an expensive game. It was not what they were doing. And it was my love of the world that was central to my whole drive. And so even though this particular iteration was not what the world needed, it was okay to go through it. It was a learning experience to go through it. So allow yourself to fail. Allow yourself to allow those reality checks to happen so that you become that great game designer that you hope to be.
Absolutely. That's so key, right? And I think that even just the learning of then thinking about, okay, well, if that publisher isn't right for me, then how do I go about publishing, right? And I think thankfully, you received both some really constructive feedback, and it was more that, at the risk of paraphrasing the feedback, it was more that a $150 game just wasn't right for their portfolio at the time, as opposed to the game. They don't feel the game can be a commercial success. So I said, okay, great. Well, then I guess the thinking in your mind is, then do I want this to still be a $150 game, or do I have to take their feedback on hand and iterate and moderate so it more fits their profile? So I know that's probably always something that I know, speaking with some local designers, that it is a bit of a tension point, right? That we can be a little bit reluctant to, as you say, not just put our ego to one side, but action feedback from a developer so that it more fits their mold as opposed to the vision in our head. So walk us through where you kind of landed with thinking about, pursuing your own creative vision versus getting some feedback to change some things that would then make the finished product very different to what you've imagined?
Absolutely. Well, I was raised by a father who basically didn't trust anyone,
Okay.
and so it some of that wore off on me, and I felt like taking an idea to a publisher was a mixed bag for me. It was a risk. It was a
Sure.
risk and return line that gave me a little bit of anxiety because I was afraid that taking my idea to a publisher might say, hey, I like this part of what he's doing. We'll dismiss the project, but we'll take it, the parts we do like, and we'll go on with it. And so I ultimately chose to become my own publisher.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a reasonable thing to do. I think that's paranoia brought on by my lineage, by my genealogy. So I would say to most people, most of you game designers in Australia, it is, there's such an amazing digital trail of proof nowadays with what we've created. And, everybody worries about patents and everybody worries about copywriting, but I would say to you, create, post, share. Share your experiences with people. Allow them into your ideas because there's proof in that. There's a track record that you create that if someone then takes an idea that you felt was central or pivotal to your mechanic or your game design, it's so easy to defend that now because it's. So I would say, I see my games. And other concepts that are major and central to my business. Other than that, I don't think you need a patent. I don't think you need copyright. Copyright isn't a terrible thing, but it can be kind of expensive too. It's like $500 or $600 to copyright a term, at least in the U.S. Maybe in Australia it's different, but I guess I would come to the designers of Australia with this. There is good news and bad news in this industry. The good news is this. You don't have to approach game design like every other designer. And the bad news is this process, if you want to be honest with yourself, requires some money. Yeah. So to start with the good news, in that you don't have to approach game design like every other designer. Most designers, I would say, Andrew, come at this with a mechanic in mind first. They come at, they have this really cool mechanic that they saw in another title that they want to emulate, but they maybe think they can do it better. Mm-hmm. Maybe you've got a few people that design based on theme, but not very many.
Yeah.
And, I come from, this idea that for me, I have a love of world. I have a love of, and going into EverQuest for the first time as a PC gamer, seeing EverQuest and exploring in EverQuest was a great thing for me. I love this idea of exploring world. World of Warcraft, this next level. I don't have square regions that I'm entering in. Things are almost seamless. I can get on a griffin, I can fly over to another region, and it doesn't seem like a square. Yeah. So to me, it was about world. And so if you take this idea of game design and you make world kind of a Christmas tree, to borrow a secular Christian idea of a Christmas tree at Christmas. The game design process for me is a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
And the rules that I apply to that Christmas tree have to fit the theme because, most Christmas trees have a theme. They're rustic, they're vintage, they're modern, they're cartoony, they're colorful, but they have a set of ornaments on them, right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
Okay. So to me, the Christmas tree is the world. And the rules that I apply to that world are the ornaments. If they're too heavy, they're going to bend the branch down that they're on, right? And if they don't fit the theme, they're going to stand out like a sore thumb.
Mm.
And so what I try to do is I start with story first and foremost in my game designs. I want to have an epic story that's compelling. I want to have compelling characters, and I want no rules. But the problem is you can't make a game with no rules. And so then
Yeah.
I begin to hang ornaments on the tree, right? And I always overload the tree because it's necessary as a game designer, I think, to overload the tree with ornaments. And then you start to take those ornaments off. What rules don't fit this particular model? What rules are not a perfect fit for that theme of ornament on that particular tree? What gives me the balance on that tree that I want Christmas morning when the kids come out to open up their presents? That being backers and all the people we hope will play our game, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I honestly feel like the best good news that I can give Australian game designers is you don't have to think like a game designer. There is no uber geek answer to this process. And I come at it, I fully admit I am not the smartest guy in the room. And I don't want to create that game. I don't want to create a game that only my uber geek friends will want to play. I want to play a game where I market it to age 14 plus, but I know damn well that 8-year-olds are going to be able to get this game readily. Does that make sense? Yeah. So
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think that's the good news for Australian game designers is don't think you have to fit a mold. If you don't love world and you love mechanic, then love mechanic. Hang your design on that mechanic and add things to it, but make sure that all the things that you add to it are genuinely additive. They're not muddying the mechanic. They're not taking away from the mechanic, that they fit with that mechanic. And so that's the good news. The bad news is this, and I think a lot of game designers are guilty of this.
Mm-hmm.
I come at this from a graphic design background.
Yeah.
I'm a print designer and a decent writer. Okay, so I know my limits. I know I'm a decent artist, but not a great one. I know I understand the basics of graphic design, of formatting documents and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the bad news is this. As game designers, we have to be honest with ourselves. If we don't accept our limitations, what we end up not doing is spending the money to hire people that are really, really good at their trade to make our ideas shine. And
Correct.
So what we end up is this half-baked idea that probably won't gain a lot of traction, that probably will end up in some sort of mediocrity, whether that be funding, support, I don't care what it is. Please know that, I want everyone listening to this to have success. I want you all to be successful. I want you to understand that this is very much within your reach.
Yes.
But what you don't have skills for, you must hire for. And when you hire, don't go on the cheap. Even if it takes half of your life to accomplish your goals, once you reach that goal, you'll be satisfied with the results as opposed to kidding yourself into, oh, that's good enough. It's not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much insight and goal within that. I might, dive in on that latest theme a little bit as well, because it's come up in our last two shows with the crew from that sound game and then Hirsch after that, where the crew from that sound game spoke about it like a wedge. So you're going to have areas of your wedge that you have expertise in, and then the areas outside of your expertise, much to that point, find who those experts are and find a way to bring them on board. And then Hirsch's perspective was more, he wants to have a base level of understanding with everything so that essentially then he can audit, or he has a better calibration on what is good and what's not. And he's quite cautious of outsourcing, but he's recognised that there's certain areas that he just doesn't have the time and energy for, and hence that's more how he's made his steer. So I guess, Jeff, I'm really keen to understand, like, what's your steer then in terms of as you said, that graphic design is your expertise, writing is your expertise. Things that are outside of that and that potentially don't give you that same amount of energy or buzz or motivation. What is kind of your thinking in terms of, I need to upskill myself a little bit here so I can at least hold a conversation versus, you know what, like this isn't my wheelhouse and I'm just going to hire the experts to do this for me?
Well, I think I'm really good as a graphic designer. I worked most of my adult life in a captive agency setting for a very large corporate entity.
Yeah.
And so they basically had 3 lines of products: window shades, projection screens and lifts, and gym equipment. Those are very diverse lines of products, right?
Yes.
And so I was the one that designed all of their catalogs over a little over 10-year period. And also I was the one that introduced all their new products. And so,
right.
and so that was a really, really good way for me to, as a designer, educate myself in very technical documents, because those products tend to be very technical in nature, right?
Yeah.
So I see those as very complementary to game design, because
Agreed.
game design is very technical. We want the technical aspects of our games to make our games feel less technical and more fun and more social. And so if our prowess and our expertise is in technical, then if we can convey that in an articulate way, then we hope that our players don't have to lift that weight, that they
Correct.
can just enjoy the work that we've done and have a pleasurable experience that isn't such a heavy lift, right?
Absolutely.
And so to me, my wheelhouse, what I always gravitated to in my job was big creative projects, because I was a print designer, so I was constantly designing and redesigning the same catalogs every 2 years. And so the product lines would kind of alternate through that period of needing to be redesigned and updated. And it was just tedious and horribly non-creative. And so whenever a big project would come down the pipeline that had a little bit of creative, facet to it, I would say, that's mine. That's my project. Give it to me. And so I got the opportunity to do a lot of really, really fun creative things and have an unlimited budget with the company I worked for, and really they trusted me with their money, and I would be able to deliver some really good results for them in the sales category after the fact. And so I think as a game designer, what you hope, at least in my case, what I hoped to be was that person that had the kind of almost project management hat, that they could wear firmly, and that they could manage a team. And I don't think that's necessarily always true. I think if you listen to people in the industry, they recommend to you, don't do anything big, start small, right? They always do that. Well, I took all of the advice that they gave me and I threw it out the window. And I said, I'm going to spend a lot of money. I'm going to do something completely opposite of what you tell me I should do, and I'm going to see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm not saying it's smart, and I'm not recommending that any of your listeners do this, because it is nice to create a small manageable project that you can contribute a larger percentage of the work to reduce costs, perhaps have some success that might then lead you to the ability to do larger projects. I'm financially okay.
Yeah.
And so I decided to kind of chase my magnum opus and just go after the world, chase after Vrahode, give people the best possible experience in this world that I've had in my head since 1990. Yeah. Do it without cost considerations. It's not a value proposition. It's a quality proposition, and just see what happens. And I know there's huge risks associated with it, but this is my lifetime.
Yeah.
This is what I've chosen to risk.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that perspective is wonderful, because a bit of a theme that's come up through all the episodes so far is feedback is a gift, and I don't diminish the value of feedback, but sometimes more feedback it's just somebody's perspective at the end of the day, right? And it's up to us as the creator to think about, okay, like, why has that feedback come? Does the source of that feedback resonate with me, or is something I'm going to hear, I'm going to absorb, but I'm still going to back myself to go down the different path because my motivations are different. Like, I've had this world in my head for 30 years. I want a quality experience that isn't bound by cost, so I'm not going to compromise on the experience and the depth and the size of that experience, even though the feedback might be, start off with a smaller project first and get some learnings and see how you go. So I think, Jeff, within that, it's a really valuable lesson. That vision and that passion comes through really clearly with what you want the Vrahode design and then playing experience to be. What do you think then, like, gives you the confidence to say that, yeah, I hear the feedback, but I'm going to back myself in. I know I'm taking on a lot, but I'm going to back myself in to bring my vision to life now, as opposed to in second, third, fourth project's time. Where do you kind of think that inner confidence comes from?
Well, I think the main thing you have to do, regardless of the size of the project, whether you're creating a small deck game, that's designed to cost less than $20 for your customers, or something big like what we're doing, is you have to approach game design with humility, and you have to listen to your playtesters, and you have to go to con if you can afford it. You have to go to con, because conventions are where you're going to get the groups that are going to give you those harsh wake-up calls. They're the ones that are going to test your assets, not just your rules. They're going to say, this tray doesn't make any sense to me. I don't like fiddling with these dice. I don't like these tokens. And we've done that. So even though I'm resolute in the general design of the world of Vrahode, and I've iterated many times on all assets, I go to con and I play test every time with people and I have a pen ready in my hand all the time. I'm always ready to write notes. I think what happens as you get towards the end of playtesting, I think you reach this critical mass where you start to have people say, I don't like that. But then you had 60% of the people that said they do like it, and 40 that don't. And so you begin to parse those criticisms, and you begin to kind of quantify them. Yes. And I think that's really important as we get to the end of our play testing. And yes, I do think it's important, Andrew, that we as designers begin to put a filter on and say, okay, these are great comments, but those don't have a place in this particular design. Maybe the next design. But I will tell you, if you are an arrogant game designer, if you are a closed-minded game designer, you are a designer that is inclined to fail. You must remain humble. You must always listen. You must always be respectful of your playtesters, even if you don't use their ideas.
Absolutely.
If you're arrogant, if you're narrow-minded, your designs will have a narrow scope. Your customers will be narrow.
Absolutely. And that goes back to your earlier theme that you have to park the ego, right? Like, it's not just parking the ego when you're presenting in front of publishers and putting your idea out there, knowing that horrible feedback could come your way and that they might think it's the worst thing they've ever seen, not, the best thing that they've ever seen. And that's exactly the same with playtesters as well, right? Like, I think, as much as you say further down the track when you've made some decisions based on feedback, if you receive feedback that's a little bit counter to the feedback that allowed you to action those things in the first place, then that's when you need to kind of qualify, okay, like, is it 40-60 or is it now 30-70 that I have to absorb this? But as you say, always keeping an open mind, is critical.
I'll give you a perfect example. Early on in the playtest season, we went to con, and we were tracking wounds via tokens, 1, 5, and 10 wound tokens.
Yeah,
and that was fine. However, as you played, you ended up having to make change to calculate accurately your wounds. And I had someone tell me, I think a tracker would be great for this, or one of those dials to to be able to turn and track wounds easier. And what I did as a designer is I took a half measure. Instead of listening to what they said and going all the way, I decided that I had a better idea. and I used 2 dice to track the wounds, which were less fiddly than wound tokens, but they weren't the actual suggestion that the player made. And so I ended up ultimately play testing the dice that I introduced, and ultimately coming to the conclusion that I should have just listened to the initial idea to go to trackers. And so that's ultimately what we ended up with. But it took me my pride going through that iteration process to where I could say, hey, I should have just listened.
Yeah.
And I would say, as a game designer, questions for changes, go ahead and try both, and try them in tandem. Let one of your playtesters try the tracker, and let one of your other playtesters try the dice. That's your idea, and let them feed back to you on which they prefer. So it saves you the iterative process of having to go linearly through design process, where you can increase the breadth of your ideas coming at you to save you time and money.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely critical. I think that, Jeff, under that whole theme that we've been discussing for the last 25, 30 minutes, like some fantastic analogies, examples. Thanks for being so vulnerable with sharing some of the learnings as well that have come through, things that you wish you had done better. I love the Christmas tree analogy. I think that's fantastic in terms of having a really clear understanding of, in your case, it's the theme and it's the world building that is the Christmas tree, but then how the ornaments then fit into that. And potentially just one question to hone in on that before I'd love to get to then the scale of Vrahode and how you manage such a big team under the theme of biting off, a big part of the elephant for such a key project. I want to get your take on, like, we've just spoken about play testing and different mechanics and different rules that no doubt ultimately influence the scale and the color of those ornaments on the tree. How do you kind of come up with an initial steer, like with that Christmas tree in mind? How do you kind of then think about, especially in such a diverse, complex world like Vrahode, how do you then kind of think, okay, I think these ornaments will fit. I want to fill up this tree dramatically from the start, but then you don't want to maybe overpopulate it, or that some ornaments might not fit. How do you go about that qualitative process up front, even before playtesting commences?
Well, I'm a big fan of analogies.
Yeah, I am too.
So I don't know or pretend to know what the road conditions are like in Australia, but in many of the roads in the U.S., they're riddled with potholes. Yeah. Or is that what you call them there, potholes?
Absolutely nailed it. Yep, correct.
Okay, potholes. All right. So I think a lot of game designers that are a lot smarter than myself, they tend to take players down a rabbit hole of rules with them. Yeah. They say, okay, come with me, right? Come with me on this journey into this particular theme. Let me take you into this rich and robust hole, if you will, this deep hole of rules, and allow me to share with you how you should experience my game design.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, my desire since the beginning of this process has always been more about, come down the road with me. We're going to take you over a number, 15 to 20, 30 potholes that you'll be able to easily navigate in your vehicle. You'll be able to get over them. They're not so deep that they're going to swallow your car. And so then you end up with this world that once you learn it, there are no deep rabbit holes or holes for you to navigate. And so that's the approach that we've decided to take with Vrahode, is to give you this world. Just to use an example, we have 8 very distinct biomes or terrain types in the world of Vrahode. You can travel mountains, plains, forest, river marsh coastal, icy tundra, desert badlands, ocean, underlands. So all of these different biomes, each of these biomes has its own pothole of rules, but they are not deep caverns of rules. They are just a way for you I want the world to seem alive and interesting and varied without it becoming cumbersome. Does that
Absolutely.
make sense?
That
And the
makes
way we
sense.
do that,
Yeah.
yeah, the way we do that in our world is we populate each of these distinct biomes with different inhabitants. So when you go into the plains, you will be fighting different enemies.
Mm.
And if you go into the mountains, you will pay more fatigue to travel there because it is more fatiguing to travel there. But it can easily be mitigated with the right gear.
Yeah.
Just like going to the icy tundra. If you have a fur cloak in the icy tundra, you can mitigate that extra cold fatigue. If you go to the
Mm.
desert in the Badlands, if you have a water skin, you can stay hydrated and you can mitigate the heat fatigue.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is give you something that on its surface is rich, but as soon as you figure out the nuances of it, then it's more about you and I sitting at a table being social than it is about us going way down some deep rule hole.
Absolutely. That
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, like, to go back on again, like the other example that you shared about your catalogs and selling and marketing quite technical products. I think within that again, like a steer that I even use in my main day job when you're dealing with numbers and trying to work out, all this data, how do you form an insight out of data and then a sales story off the back of it? It's how do you make the complex simple? And I think that
Right.
then almost the parallel to game design is then how do you make the technical fun, right? So you want to make sure that there's enough nuance and there's enough IP that somebody can think, wow, this is a really rich, unique, immersive experience. It's nothing like I've ever had before. Almost by definition, there's a lot of task specificity associated with that because there's nothing like it. But it has to be immersive, it has to be fun. And that goes back to that social aspect that you said, right? That you don't want people to be reading through your rule book for hours on hours to work out how to cross over the mountains or how to mitigate their fatigue. It has to be, okay, great. We know we're in this situation. How do we do it in a really fun, social, compelling way? So having that steer is really important to then how that informs the design choices and that you're more looking for potholes and getting feedback on potholes as opposed to the deep rabbit holes.
Well, another thing I would submit to you, Andrew, is this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the industry has taken uh, an avenue, if you will. They've made a choice to go down a particular avenue to make games of increasing complexity accessible to players, to a larger
Yeah.
group of players. And
Yeah.
the choice that they've chosen in order to do that is complex iconography.
Mm.
And I would say this to your Australian designers: that's complete crap.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you have complex iconography in your game design, guess where your players are going to spend their time? They're going to spend their time with their nose in a book, making sure that they know what all those symbols mean. And
Mm.
so in Vrahode, what we have done is we have eliminated all iconography and replaced it with plain speak English.
Yeah.
And so an 8-year-old can read the card, never look at a rule book, and know exactly what the skill that their blade character has to do, how their blade character skill works against an enemy. And so I
Yeah.
would caution you, I think they originally did this to decrease the size of cards and
Mm.
to make them
Mm.
smaller so that they could replace a lot of words with a simple symbol. But as I look at the token sets and the symbology and the iconography of these game systems, I will say to you, and I will submit to you humbly, our approach is a completely different approach. It has nothing to do with that. It's about plain language. And there's nothing wrong with that. It may take a few more words to accomplish that on your cards, but if your game requires cards, but the language allows your players to stay focused on the immersion and the social aspect of your gaming, to me, that's a win. That's a win for your players.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
I think, again, for me, like how I kind of summarize that thread is that, like, a really kind of clear steer for yourself is, like, limit the referencing back to the rule book. Almost like
absolutely.
a bit of, like, any informal metric is, like, how many times do players have to go back because they're not understanding this scenario, this card, what it does. And then to take that a layer deeper at the risk of going down the rabbit hole, your main steer is that, again, it's it's a very unique, diverse world, but the social aspect is key, right? So anything that acts as a barrier to that social interaction is something that you're looking to minimize from the game.
Yes.
And hence that's provided your steer on, again, do we go down complex iconography where if you've got a photographic memory and if you played the game for 20 hours straight, then you'll know it all perfectly. It's like, well, that's not my audience, right? My audience is I want 8-year-olds to play this with their families. I want 14-year-olds. I want 30-year-olds to be able to play it. And then as a result of that, what has to be true from a design perspective to make sure that that experience comes through?
Absolutely. And something else that can be said briefly on that front is that we live in an industry. I can't tell you how humbled and honored I am to be part of an industry that has been so welcoming to me. And
Yeah.
I've talked to established companies like Creative Game Studios and Jamie Jolly with Shadowborn Games and so many other amazing companies that give me support and just encouragement. It's a really, really welcoming industry if you engage
Absolutely.
with it.
Yeah.
And so I would say don't be afraid to become part of the industry, because it's very rare that we find an industry where people recognize that this is not about money. Even the successful companies recognize that this is normally a passion project for people, and it's something that they want to share with the world. And so don't be scared to go out there and seek out help from companies, especially, small to medium companies that you're not intimidated by interacting with, because in every instance where I have done so, I have been rewarded greatly by that interaction, and that's why I'm still here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. And that might be something that I'm really keen to dive into as well, knowing that Gen Con has just happened. And again, it's a matter of putting yourself out there, meeting other people in the industry, hearing their thoughts, getting their help, again, kind of seeing that firsthand collaborative community in action. So I must confess I hadn't heard of Gen Con before 2 months ago, probably, and now I'm already thinking about how potentially I can get some of my, even though they're very Australian-esque designs, how can I adapt my designs to a more US market and potentially feature there next year? So I'm really keen to get your take on what Gen Con was like, how you found it, what you loved about it, what you wish you'd do differently next time, all that type of stuff with the experience.
Well, let's start with my pitch to you, Andrew, for what you need to do.
Yes.
And you need to do exactly what I just did. You need to go through it's called the FEPT Hall, which is the First Exposure Playtest Hall. And that's where you take your designs. You can have one design, you can have 4 designs. You go into a hall, the people that sign up to play your games know that you're in development. And so therefore they're expecting to give you the constructive and meaningful feedback that you hope to get from a group.
Yeah, right.
This is my 4th convention of the year. The first 3 conventions that I did this year, I had my own booth. And so I was able to control my demo times, the length of my demos, the interaction with customers. But as a small company in rural Montana, tiny, this big, it was important to me to be a little bit bigger fish in a little bit smaller pond in the first cons that I did. So I started out with Genghis Con, which is in Aurora, which is a suburb of Denver, Colorado. My second con was Kubla Con, and that was in San Francisco, California.
Yep.
My third con was a big con, and that was Origins in Columbus, Ohio. That's probably the second biggest board game, card game, and RPG con in the U.S.
Sure.
And
okay.
I had a booth for that.
Yep.
And I had my business partners that are supplying some stuff for my pledge manager in the booth with us, and that was a great experience. And then Gen Con, it's so hard to get in there as a small company because the waiting list is so long to get in on the exhibitor hall floor. And so
Yeah.
we
Okay.
just did the first exposure playtest hall. It was affordable. It was an amazing experience. The downside of that is that you have to carry your booth on your shoulder
Yeah.
as you come and you set up your demo and you run it, and then you have to get off so that the next designer can pitch their game.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So it's temporary as opposed to, as you say, with a booth where you're basically there from the first minute the trade hall opens
Right.
to the last minute that everybody's out of there.
Right. But if you've
Yeah.
got numerous ideas, Andrew, that you're wanting to promote or at least get feedback on, that first exposure playtest hall will give you the quality of playtesters that I think you want.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. And I think that like walking through that strategy is like makes a lot of sense, right? In terms of different cons of different scale. No doubt you would have learned a lot from the smaller cons that then informed Origins, and then again Gen Con being a little bit different because the audience is larger, the cost is more. So again, there's more of that trade-off with what you want to get out of it. I guess for any listeners who might, or watchers who might have attended conventions before but not showcasing just as an attendee, or even for anybody who hasn't attended anything like this before, kind of what's kind of your objectives going into it? And I guess even on reflection, like how do you think your objectives varied in a San Francisco con versus an Origins versus a Gen Con, so that you could kind of honestly look at yourself in the mirror afterwards and say, this was a success for these three key reasons, or on reflection, I want to do this differently next time. How do you, I guess, have a playbook for what great looks like for a convention
Yeah,
experience?
I think the first thing you need to do in your first con is you need to share with your players your passion. You
Yes.
need to be at the table. You need to come in with come in as humbly as you can and as cost effectively as you can. Come
Yep.
in, dip your toe in the water, and show people what you have. Show them why it excites you and why they should be excited,
I love
right?
that. Yeah.
And then as a graphic designer and as a booth designer in the past, I had designed trade show booths for my company and things. I think what you tend to migrate towards, once you get the players on your side and you know your game is fun, you know you're not kidding yourself. This is real. This is actually a game. This is something that people will want to play. Then I think what happens is you migrate from sitting with them and playing and sharing your passion to basically kind of moving over towards wanting to interact with the media and the press and saying, I
Mm,
need coverage of this so that I can reach a wider audience with my excitement,
yes.
right? But
Yeah.
don't rush it. Don't rush it. If you have to take a whole season of conventions to
Mm,
play with people, then the next season work on the media. For me, we had kind of a long glide path towards crowdfunding. And so I kind of wanted my first convention season to morph from playing and running games to kind of not eliminating that, but doing both, to kind of playing, sharing my excitement, making sure that they were in on the, ready to back us, but also giving interviews. Always be accessible. If you're not accessible to the media and you're not accessible to the press, you are only hurting yourself, because that is your greatest vehicle. That is your greatest vehicle, especially when you get outside of Australia, you get into the larger media markets of Europe and the United States. Get in front of the media. Whore yourself out. I don't care what you have to do. Do it. Get
yeah.
in front of those cameras. And when I'm at con, I'm always looking for the booths with cameras.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, what are you doing? What are you guys doing? Well, we're interviewing game designers. Hey, I'm a game designer. Do you have a time slot? Get in front of them. And I've made so many friends that way, and I've gotten such great exposure. So be prepared, game designers, that you might be able to be an introvert while you're designing, but when you're promoting, time to get in
Yeah.
front of the cameras and be the one that everyone wants to see.
Absolutely. that's such a
Yeah.
key lesson, right? And I think that, like, at the end of the day, regardless whether it's game design, in our career, in life, in anything, right? Like, we're our biggest advocate, right? So if we can't advocate for ourselves, then how do we expect somebody else to advocate for us? Like, you're actually asking
Totally.
somebody to do something that you're not comfortable doing yourself. So again, however you find that inner confidence, right? And again, to go back to a bit of a familiar thread, if it's about parking the ego, if it's about that fear of feedback or that fear of loss, just got to throw caution to the wind. Like, whatever that mental script has to be that you can authentically believe it, you just got to do it, right? And I think that there's a really nice steer there to being accessible with the media, but then also being accessible with your people as well. Like, you need to find a way. It's not an or trade-off, it's an and I know that with that becomes extra time, extra investment, and there will be time at my booth or in front of the cameras, but we need to find a way that always is the Christmas tree, or always is the North Star in this way, and how you get
Yeah,
there is, I guess, up to individual discretion.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I reckon we could talk for another hour comfortably on more on
Sure.
Gen Con and different learnings through Vrahode and how the different iterations have worked, how it's like managing a big team. But just looking at the time, we've been going for about 51 minutes, which has absolutely flown by. I'm really keen to know if you've got a question for myself or a question for the community as well that I can ask my next guest on the show.
Wow. So I'm supposed to present a question for you.
Yeah, you can give it some thought, or one to the community, alternatively as well.
Well, all I would say is this, I'm a person who is, I would say, very kind of nichey in my interests. In
Yeah.
that I grew up as a 10-year-old. I started playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was the cardstock yellow cover book of
Hmm.
AD&D. Back when I was about 10, when my friend Fat Eric would invite me over to his house to play,
Hmm.
and I always have loved role playing games and games based on some kind of escapism.
Hmm.
And what I would say to the game designers of Australia is, what is important to you? Is escapism important to you as game designers, or is it more about creating a satisfying mechanism for your players? For example, worker placement, Tableau, Forex. What is the most important thing to you as a game? If mine is world and escapism, what triggers you as a game designer and inspires you to create?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for myself, yeah, what's inspired this? Essentially, what's inspired me, right? I think that my story is probably quite unique in that I'm not a massive gamer. Like, yeah, I kind of go to a few games nights now with friends that, it's just a more social or interactive way than maybe going out to a local restaurant for dinner that we'll do it with the game as well. It's not with particularly complex games or heavy games. The kind of Catan is our limit. Exploding Kittens
Yeah.
features as well. Some of my own designs feature within that as well. I think that where my inspirations probably come from for it, potentially growing up in a single child household, like I remember that I'd be watching Australian football or I'd be watching cricket and I'd have my own games going on the side. So my Australian football games would either just be four dice, particularly, and you could use those four dice to show what scores would be for one team every quarter. Basically, how our scoring works is you have goals that are worth 6 points, you have behinds that are worth 1 point. So you roll two dice. The one that's on the left is the goals. The one that's on the right is the behind. With cricket, the
Uh-huh.
same thing. I kind of had this game, and I've got the latest prototype 2 meters to me or 2 yards to me on this side here. That I want to get in front of Cricket Australia to get that one licensed as well. So I think for myself, what's guided it has always just been I've kind of always just had fun with this being a creative pursuit, even since probably quite similar to yourself, like even from quite a young age when I was in primary/elementary school. I think that as I've got older and I've added probably more strategic rigor and, I work in FMCG for a day job, so frequently working with data and insights and all that stuff. I think for me, I've recognized that I think there's a gap in the market for largely kind of cool, either sports-based games that have some level of thematic relevance to the actual sporting code. Or I even think about my Marvel project, right? And when I walked out of Endgame on opening day with my wife back in 2019, it was like my head just went to straight away. Like, I wonder if there's a game out there where you need to battle other players to capture the Infinity Stones. And that was the first thing I did. We were heading to Fiji for a 3-night holiday that night. But again, was on Google, was researching games while we're in Fiji, as much as it was time to tune out on, a hammock and in the glorious waters over there for a few nights. It's just all I could think about. So I think for myself, design is just a passion area for me. But now I've laddered on my business and my commercial now to try and think, is there white space for this? Is this unique? But I think what really motivates myself is going back to your area about theme before, is making sure it's thematically relevant. So not to market my own designs too much, but like in AFL, so Australian football as an example, our average scores come out roughly to be about 80 points. It's a little bit lower than basketball as an example. So I want to make sure that if somebody scores 90 points across the total game, that they're going to have a greater chance of winning than losing. Because if the scores are coming out to be like 120 to 130, and that person who scored 120, like, man, I scored 120. Like, 120 is an awesome score. Like, how did I not win this? Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And yeah, sure, there are outlier games in Australian football. There was a game last night where it was 101 to 109, right? So, and like with my game, you can still score 60 points in a quarter because, again, you might find that over the course of our 24-round season where there are 9 games played per round, you'll probably find there are 2 or 3 quarters where a team will score 60 or more points. So, again, I want to have that vehicle in there so that you feel really good because you know it's rare, but it's still thematically accurate. So I think that's where I probably get a lot of it's a passion for design, it's a passion for finding white space, but then I also want to make sure that it's thematically relevant with the property that I'm adapting.
Yeah. What do you think about this, Andrew? Don't you think it's a good idea for you and I both to encourage the game designers of Australia to understand that even if they don't have the opportunity to get those franchise deals,
Yes.
I think it's important to note that franchise deals are a two-edged sword. Yes, there's money in franchise deals, but there's also a limit to the creativity. You almost end up with these golden handcuffs on. You're a bit beholden to that franchise. And so I would say be careful as game designers. Not that it's a problem for new designers, because it just doesn't happen. It tends to be your second or your third iteration, your third product, where you get approached to maybe do some franchise work. But just beware. I would say designers beware. Take on franchise work at your peril, because you do give up creative license. You do give up control when you go for the money with a franchise deal. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I think I've seen a lot of companies do it in the U.S., and I've seen a lot of them go, I wish I wouldn't have done that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's a really good steer, right? And I think that even like they're an extra stakeholder to manage, they're a critical stakeholder to manage. Like they need to sign off on everything, and I've probably even been quite, in some ways, pleasantly surprised at that, because we deal with Disney, ANZ here as kind of the corporate owner of Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
They have had some creative choices with which villains feature in the game, as an example, or what the board looks like. And I was just like, wow, like on one hand, it's cool that they care so much about a little project that a guy is doing for a side hustle, but hopefully will become a lot bigger globally, right? And so it's cool that, wow, like, my project is on Disney's radar, that they're providing creative control on, I can't have Red Skull in the game and I need to feature Thanos' henchmen, basically the children of Thanos. But then on the other hand, it's like, oh man, it'd be really cool to feature Red Skull because he's the keeper of the Soul Stone, and I think that thematically works. So that's the trade-off you kind of have to accept, eyes wide open going into it, because it's their property at the end of the day.
I also like this idea too of encouraging new designers to chase after franchises that are important to them that may not have a following, but sometimes when you respect someone's artwork or you respect someone's design, to approach them to do a game based on their artwork, I think is a very legitimate avenue for designers that many people may not have thought of. But what it can do with the right relationship is actually lend you a lot of assets for your game.
Yeah.
If you can compensate an artist for their work, but include their work in your design. I'm a big fan of an artist called Phlegm, and it's PHLEGM.
Okay,
like what you cough.
Yeah, I'm about to say. Yeah.
What you cough up when you have a cold. He's an exceptionally prolific street artist. He creates art on a lot of derelict buildings in very depressed areas, but his art is just stunning to me. And I've approached him several times to try to get him to let me make a game of his artwork, and to no avail. But that doesn't mean that other aspiring designers in Australia will have the same luck. They might actually be able to get those amazing artists to become part of their designs, and that's a gift. That's a gift.
100%. Very much so. Well, Jeff, it's been awesome having you on. I think, as I said before, we could easily do an episode, 2 or 3, I think, just talking about various aspects of not just your project, but also various themes, and really diving into what's worked, your philosophies, your analogies, the learnings, and then also a lot more about what's next, and not just your vision in getting the game to market, but ultimately where in 2, 3, 4 years' time, you kind of want the game to be. But I think to recap, some of kind of the key takeaways for me is, and some of your key quotes as well, is allow yourself to fail, and that whole idea about just parking the ego. I think that it's all very well and good to say, I'm going to put myself out there, but it's not just the action of putting yourself out there. You have to have the right mindset. And that might be dealing with publishers originally. It might be dealing with the public. It might be dealing with play testers. It's how you facilitate feedback. Yes, you need to have an understanding on what do I want my game to be that kind of helps qualify that. But you have to approach everything with respect and humility. And I really love those key kind of words that we've reflected on. I think also as well, that whole idea of sharing. Yes, there's always going to be a nervousness, especially for first-time creators of, if I put my idea out there, will somebody bigger steal an element of it? But the more you share, there is that digital trail. You have physical prototypes for something. Really, copyright should protect. And I know the legislation will differ depending on different parts of the world. But again, just put yourself out there, because it is a very supportive community where I haven't heard of any examples of IP being stolen. So certainly do that. Again, I love the Christmas tree analogy. I think there's something really to that, where what the Christmas tree represents will be different for different people. For yourself, it's more the world, and then the ornaments and the rules, and then how do they complement each other. But even just this specific part of that analogy of, if the rules are too heavy or if the ornaments are too heavy, then the trees will break. Or if the ornaments don't thematically fit with the tree, then again, it'll be an eyesore as opposed to something that's really beautiful. And then I think how that kind of funnels into it is that, you want that Christmas tree to be beautiful, and for it to be beautiful, it has to be unique. There has to be a lot of intricate technical design that has gone into it. But you can't have people then looking at every branch thinking, wow, like, how on earth did they put this together? They have to be able to look back at it and think, oh, this is actually really cool, or this enhances my living room, or this is something that the kids are going to be really excited to get their Christmas presents from afterwards. And then how does that then play into the experience that you want your gamers to have? And for yourself specifically, it's, you want them to have fun. It's that social experience. Hence why now it's collaborative, not combative. Hence why you've gone away with complex iconography, because you don't want players to be buried knee deep in a rule book. And I think the last really big one is share your passion at conventions. Like, have a game plan, always be accessible, share your passions. And I love your quote, and this will probably be my last one for today to sign off on, but work out what excites you and then why they should be excited. I think as game designers, if we can think a lot about that, and be able to communicate that effectively, it'll go a long way behind ultimately getting more people excited about your game. I mean, hopefully it means they back it. Hopefully it means you get retailers on board, you get media people on board, and the vision can come to life.
Absolutely. And I would say this, I think one of my favorite parts about this, being able to talk to you for over an hour, is the fact that we really didn't talk about Vrahode. We talked about game design. We talked about what, Australian game designers need to hear in order for them to have their piece of this industry. And
Yes.
I guess in parting, what I would say to you above everything else is don't be afraid, people. Get out there, risk yourself, be humble, be willing to accept that you don't have the best ideas, but they're out there. Approach the industry humbly, seek out help. It's there for you. If you want help, it's there. I mean, if anybody wants to call me, they can call me at any time. I'm always available, to give guidance and to save people from some of the steps that I had to go through as a designer. So even though our hours are off a little bit from you to me. Yeah. Anyway, I would say this, just follow your dreams, be humble, accept that there are some failures probably coming. That's okay.
Absolutely.
That's not a reason to stop. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, a conflict largely is always the misalignment of expectations. And I think inner conflict is having, not even thinking through your own expectations, right? So as long as you kind of go in eyes wide open to, this is the experience I'm going to have. It might not be perfect. I'm going to learn something like this, but I'm going to approach it with respect for myself, respect for others. Then again, it's all part of the journey. So we may as well have fun with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm so honored to have over an hour of your time. Wow.
Nah, thanks so much, Jeff. As you said before, I know there's a little bit of a time difference between Montana and Melbourne, and we're actually heading out for lunch in less than an hour's time. So I'm going to get the hurry up from my darling other half probably sooner rather than later. But again, it's been fantastic talking. A lot of clear takeaways, a lot of things that I've learned from it. Again, thanks for being so open with your development journey, the choices and the trade-offs that you've made in ultimately bringing your vision to life. Thanks again for also being authentic with when you've zagged versus when the feedback has kind of encouraged you to zig, but then some of the reasons as to why you have done that, and how you've still lent into the feedback. But there's been some certain areas of your own vision that you want to bring to life that's kind of enabled that decision. So incredibly insightful. For all of our listeners and viewers, again, thank you for your support. Thanks for the feedback, the constant encouragement. Again, really looking to this to be a really useful reference, not just for Australian designers, but for anybody around the world who's seeking to understand more about our industry and what it takes to successfully bring a project to life. So as always, comments, questions, feedback, more than welcome, and look forward to seeing you next time.